It began without warning, with a spectacle, without the familiar chance that usually surrounds moments like Donald Trump. There was no emergency press conference, no flylights outside a courthouse, no dramatic countdown on cable television. Just a ruling. A carefully worded legal decision released quietly by the Supreme Court. But within minutes of its publication, the impact was unmistakable. Washington froze. Wall Street hesitated. The political world stopped mid-motion. The language of the ruling was restrained, clinical, almost emotionless, yet its meaning was devastatingly clear. The Trump organization, as it had existed for decades, ordered to be fully dissolved. And not fined, not restricted, not temporarily suspended. Dissolved. For a brief moment, the noise vanished. News anchors paused mid-sentence. Legal analysts stared at their screens in disbelief. Even longtime allies struggled to process what they were witnessing. This was not a symbolic slap on the wrist. It was a definitive legal endpoint. The court was not negotiating. It was concluding. With imminent headlines exploded across the internet, social media erupted into a chaos. Several cried political persecution. Critics called it accountability long delayed. But regardless of ideology, everyone understood one thing. This was unprecedented. The Trump organization was never just a company. It was a brand, a symbol, a personal extension of power, wealth, and identity. To dissolve it was not merely to dismantle buildings or contracts. It was to strike at the core of a structure that had operated for years on the assumption that influence could be enforced in this testament. This ruling represented the legal system asserting dominance over a name that had repeatedly tested its limits. And then came the second shock. As politicians scrambled and media cycles spiraled into outrage, one voice cut through the chaos with calm precision. Warren Buffett. No shouting. No political framing. No moral grandstanding. Buffett did not speak about Trump himself. He spoke about systems. A mind of Midas. About what happens when institutions finally enforce rules that everyone claims to respect but barely expect to be abolished. The contrast could not have been sharper. Trump's world thrived on spectacle, conflict, and intention. Buffett's world runs on credibility, discipline, and trust. And when Buffett speaks during moments like this, investors listen, regulators listen, and history tends to tax ties right. In that instant, this stopped being just a legal ruling. It became a signal. A message that power has limits, the brands are not shields, and that even the most defiant emperors can be dismantled when the system desist and no calibrated and no. To understand how the situation reached this point, the clock must be turned back. For years, the Trump organizers hyperloaded at the intersection of business and politics, a space where scrutiny is inevitable but accountable, but accountability is often diluted. Over time, investigations multiplied. Tax questions, asset valuations, financial disclosures, lending practices. Individually, each issue appeared manageable. Collectively, they formed a pattern. Investigators documented discrepancies across years of transactions, filings, and internal communications. What emerged was not a series of isolated mistakes, but a structure that critics argued enabled repeated misrepresentation. The core concern was not one violation, but repetition. And repetition in the eyes of the law signals something far more generous than errors. Its signals design. What made the Supreme Court's decision extraordinary was not emotion of politics, but logics. The ruling did not argue that the Trump organization had crossed the line once or twice. It argued that the line itself had been absorbed into the structure of the company. According to the court, repeated misrepresentations of assets, valuations, and financial conditions were not accidental. They were systemic. Patterns not anomalies. And Buffett is aware the law becomes unforgiving. The justice focused on a core legal principle rarely applied at this scale. When a corporate structure repeatedly produces violations, punishment alone is no longer sufficient. Fines can be absorbed. Restrictions can be navigated. Temporary oversight can be waited out. But when a structure itself enables misconduct, it is considered legally unfit to operate. This is a threshold most companies never expect to reach. And it is the threshold that destroys assumptions of immunity. The court frame is running as preventive rather than punitive. The organization as constructed was deemed capable operating lawfully while continuing violations. CAC conclusion left very few legal options. Dissolution wasn't much extreme. It was logical. This is where the case becomes far more dangerous than a story about Trump alone. Corporate dissolutions of this magnitude are rare not because corporations behave perfectly, but because cars are high installation now than install cars topolis domino large result of does resting age. Employees lose jobs? Creditors face uncertainty. Markets of shock. But the court addressed this head on. It stated clear that protecting third parties is not just fine, allowing a structurally unlawful entity to continue or for entity to continue operating even if innocent. Oversight mechanisms were built directly into the ruling. Thursdays was supervised liquidation. Assets would be distributed control, control. Financial records would remain under scrutiny. The method was unmistakable. This was not symbolic punishment. It was structural intervention. Legal experts immediately recognized the precedent in the decision. If found, it expands the circumstance under which can move and finds and compliance problems indirectly. Its mental cooperative and waitership demonstrates waitership demonstrates derivative shirt fodder. Political connections, economic footprint, and public visibility were explicitly rejected as shields. The law, the court emphasized appeals to evidence and behavior, not fame. The principle sent a quite chill to boardrooms for remove from Trump's empire. Because this case would define risk. It suggested that unsmith cannot become systemic. Survival is no longer guaranteed, no matter how powerful the brand. For Trump personally, the implications were devastating. The organization was more than a business. It was a financial engine, platform, and a source of leverage, dissipating it marketing into wealth, influence, and long-term control. But the damage extended beyond money. The perception of invincibility factored, and passion in both politics and finances power. Markets reacted accordingly. Projects tied to the organization face uncertainty. Partners resist exposure. Institutions that once viewed association as advantageous began calculating reputationally patients dead. This is how power collapses in the real world. Not through dramatic explosions, but through withdrawal. Silence, distance, hesitation. One by one stretches that unsimplified in flipping and stepping away. The ruling is so far a broader reckoning within American capitalism itself. For decades, there has been an unspoken assumption that size and visibility provide protection. That enforcement weakens as influence grows. This didn't challenge that assumption directly. It suggests that there is a point where tolerance ends, where institutions decide that enforcing standards cost less than allowing credibility to erode further, and that religious extended far beyond a single company. The political shockwaves were immediate and impossible to contain. Washington was fought into recalibration. Republican leaders who had spent years balancing loyalty to Donald Trump with institutional survival suddenly found the neutral leader was no longer an option. Some moved quickly to acknowledge the authority of the Supreme Court while carefully avoiding direct confrontation with Trump himself. Others, the blade of the MAGA base, went in the opposite direction, denouncing the ruling as an elite-driven as an elite carbon hack and warning the conservative power itself whether still was under siege. The divide was no longer subtle. It was visible, public, and streeted. Behind closed doors, party strategies debated an uncomfortable truth. Trump's dominance had always relied on the person. The consequences did not apply to him. That perception had now been formally shattered. Not by borders, not by rivals, but by the legal system. For moderates, the ruling creators faced argue for distance for a return to institutional credibility. For loyalists, it became a rallying cry, proof that the system was hostile and must be confronted. Democrats seized the moment to emphasize accountability in the rule of law, flaming the dissolution as evidence that checks and balances still function, even tells lemons of ours power. Trump's response followed a familiar pattern. Outrage, defiance, claims of fusion, caused to release the powers. But legal analysts were bond. Appeals got delayed but not erased. The machinery had already begun moving. Assets would be unwound, contracts recessed, oversight imposed. And as the process unfolded, something more damaging than outrage began to take shape. Silence. Corporate parties stopped commenting. Financial institutions recalculated exposure. Associated with the Trump brand on the badge of power became a liability to be managed. This is where long-term damage truly takes root. Not in headlines, but in his vision. Not in outrage, but in withdrawal. Unscathed, Warren Buffett's word echoed quietly through the chaos. Because he reminded observers were non-trust. When governance collapses, markets respond eventually, no matter how famous the name added. By the end of the first 24 hours, it was clear this was no longer just an American legal story. International observers watched closely, recognizing the broader implication. A political business empire long as to untouchable had been formally dismantled, dimensional farce. Fact on reshape assumptions about power. For Trump, the consequences extend far beyond finances. A dissolution strikes directly at legacy. It reframes his story from dominance to defiance, from builder-challenger of limits. Loyalty may persist, but loyalty cannot resurrect a structure erased by law. And for the system itself, this moment will be studied for years. As growth that enforcement can escalate. At tolerance has an endpoint. And that when institutions decide credibility matters more than fear, even the most fortified emperors tend for. The Trump organization is finishes. But what it represents, the collision between power, law, and accountability is only beginning to be fully understood.